Since the Iranian Revolution of 1979, Tehran has invested heavily in its strategy towards the Arab world. The aim of this panel is to unpack two realities. What drives Tehran's Arab policies, and how is Iran performing overall? Yesterday's violent protest in Iraq is a timely reminder that while Iran has created many partners in the Arab world, from Hamas to Assad in Syria to the Houthis in Yemen, there are also many Arabs that deeply resent Tehran's agenda and policies. And finally, Iran and the US could be in the final days of a possible new nuclear deal. This could be a narrow deal focused on Iran's nuclear program, or perhaps a step towards a broader US-Iranian dialogue. If so, how could this play out in the Arab world, good, bad, or anything in between? To discuss these matters, MEI is delighted to welcome three outstanding experts. In the interest of time, I will introduce them by name and affiliation only, but you can see their full impressive bios on our website. Let me start off with Greg Goss, who is a professor at international affairs at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas AMU University. Next, we have Mahmoud Salyol-Ghalam, who is a non-resident scholar here at the Middle East Institute. Last but not least, we have Randa Slim, who is also a colleague at MEI and a senior fellow and the director of conflict resolution and Track 2 dialogues at the Middle East Institute. Just a few pointers from me before we start. To submit your questions, please use Zoom's Q&A feature, which you can find on your Zoom screens. For those calling in by phone or watching our panel on live stream, you can ask a question by emailing events@mei.edu. And feel free to ask a question anytime throughout the panel. I'll be looking out for your questions, and I integrate as many of those questions into the conversation as possible. With all that said and put aside, let's start the panel, which I look forward to, and we'll have a hard end at 11, so we have just under an hour. Mahmoud, let me start with you, then I go to Greg, and I go to Randa. Give us, Mahmoud, the big picture since 1979. How would you say the main principles, or how would you describe Iran's main principles in terms of its outreach to the Arab world? What are the key drivers behind Iranian policy?
Thank you so much, Alex, for the invitation. And I'm very pleased to be with my colleagues, Greg and Randa. Of all the regions that Iran has projected its foreign policy in the post-revolutionary period, in Asia, in Europe, in the Middle East, the most turbulent and unstable relations have been with the Arab world. And I think we need to understand the revolutionary mentality of the leadership in the post-revolutionary period. If you just go back a bit in history, in the 1960s, the fundamentalist literature of Egypt was widely translated and read by the religious opposition in Iran. And we also, if we go further, the Iranian opposition in exile were mostly concentrated in Damascus, in southern Lebanon, and also in Egypt, and also in Iraq. They were mostly associated with Palestinian groups and Palestinian revolutionaries. So with their long stay in those Arab countries, their calculation was that Arab societies are disillusioned with nationalism, and they're seeking a new paradigm shift. And so religious fundamentalism was the fashion of the day in the 60s and the 70s. You'll barely hear an Iranian opposition figure who had stayed in Turkey or in Pakistan. They were mostly in Arab countries and in those particular places that I outlined. So when the revolution took place, their immediate attention was towards the Arab countries. And they associated themselves particularly with Palestinians in Syria and Lebanon. And the idea was that Arab societies won't change and Arab governments are vulnerable. But the Iran-Iraq war changed the Iranian narrative on the region. the Iranian leadership began to understand the limits and the constraints of power. And in the aftermath of the Iran-Iraq war, with the period of economic reconstruction and state building beginning in 1989, and in the absence of charismatic leadership, Iran focused on the Shia communities in the Arab world. And with the floating of the idea of regime change scenario in Washington in the beginning of the 1990s, Iran's approach and the calculation, especially with the deep state and the revolutionary class in Iran, was twofold. One was to reactivate the abandoned nuclear program, and the other one was to activate the Shia community in the region in the interest of national security and regime security after 1989. So the attention of the revolutionary class was for the region, because the idea was that American and Iranian interests are incompatible. Israeli and Iranian interests and definitions of the region are incompatible. Therefore, Iran needs a leverage in order to approach American threats, Israeli threats. So this is how I would summarize Iranian approach towards the Arab world. In the first decade of the revolution, I think it was cloaked in ideology, in religious fundamentalism, the so-called export of the revolution. But after 1989, I would say Iranian approach has ideological posturing, but it's truly based on Iran's national security and regime security concerns.
Thank you, Mahmoud. Just a quick follow-up. I mean, what you just said suggests to me that if you want to look at the last 43 years of Islamic Republic posture towards the Arab world, is that first decade, the 1980s, where the Islamic Republic is premature, doesn't know really what it's doing, is trying to find its way, and its actions could have been perceived to be offensive, expansionist, if you will. But you're saying after 89 and Iran going into state building mode, that changed. I just wanted to push back. If you're sitting in the Gulf states or in Amman or somewhere, I think a lot of people still see Iranian policies in the region as sort of being offensive and expansionist. How would you reply to them?
Yes, of course. I only compared the notion of ideology. Certainly, Iran is projecting power, prestige, influence, but I think it's fundamentally in the interest of Iran's national security. So it has internal concerns. It's not based on ideology. I think Iran understands the limits of ideology in the Arab world. It does have pockets of influence in almost all Arab countries, but the posturing and the presence in the region is certainly offensive. Yeah,
thank you. Great. I'd love to hear your reaction to what Mahmoud just said. And I also wanted to ask you, regardless of what it is, and obviously Mahmoud put out all the relevant points, but people will go different directions in terms of what they fundamentally will subscribe to. But regardless of all that, from a position of the United States, what's true is that the last 43 years, the US has often found itself struggling against Iran and pro-Iranian entities in broader Middle East. How would you describe that struggle today? Or perhaps if you want to talk about the history and the trajectory of where we've come from and where we're likely to go.
So I do think that the US-Iranian relationship is one that is almost completely defined by the domestic politics on both sides. Although there have been leaders in both countries who have sought to kind of break out of the post-1979 patterns, really anti-Iranian sentiment in the partisan politics of the United States has just gotten more intense, I think, as in so much in American politics, things have been polarized on a partisan basis, with the Republican Party basically being profoundly committed to regime change in Iran. And the Democratic Party kind of divided between people willing to reach out to Iran on a quid pro quo basis and people who are still extremely leery of Iran, largely because of Iran's hostility toward Israel. And of course, on the Iranian side, and Mahmoud would speak better to this than me, but anti-Americanism has become, I think, a fundamental element of many regime elites' legitimation strategy. And whether they really believe it or not, I don't know what they really believe. But it's certainly extremely useful to them, and has been part of the ideology that has that the Iranian regime has used to rally support for itself domestically and explain some of its own failures. So I think that because it's so tied up with domestic politics on both sides, it's really hard to break. The other thing that I'd like to say just as starting out is that I hate to throw in a little international relations theory here, but it can help us explain the intensity of the conflicts here, I think. This is what I think of as a classic security dilemma. And by security dilemma, I just don't mean a security problem, right? The security dilemma is a very specific IR theory concept. And the basis of the concept is the more secure, the more I do to make myself secure, the more insecure I make you feel. And for a regime like Iran, which sees the United States as a mortal enemy to the regime, and sees Israel and many of the Arab states that are allied with the United States as just part and parcel of that American strategy against it, that would lead the Iranian regime, for purely defensive reasons, to build up its capacities and to push its influence forward to the extent that it can in the Arab world. I think plenty of people in Iran at the top levels think that this strategy is very defensive in the face of what they see as major threats. But if you're sitting in the Arab world, in the Gulf states, or even at further remove from Iran geographically, you look at this buildup of Iranian power and you can't help but say this is a threat to us. Mm. And so in this sense, you get into a conflict spiral, as each side sees itself as basically defensive, but sees the other side as aggressive and offensive. So it's really hard to break that. Add in the fact that we have so many broken Arab states, right? Not just the states that got broken from the Arab uprisings, like Syria and Yemen, but also states that were broken before, Iraq, broken by the United States invasion, Lebanon, which had been broken by its own civil war and Israeli and Syrian interventions previously. Iran has been extremely successful in being able to increase its influence in these broken states. And those kinds of geopolitical gains are really hard, I think, for any regime to turn off. And so on the one hand, the nuclear issue is something that one might be able to negotiate. But I can't imagine any Iranian government giving up the kinds of influence that it's been able to establish in many of these broken states in the Arab world. And the backlash to that, as we're seeing in Iraq and perhaps in other places down the line, is going to be the dynamic there more than any kind of negotiated solution, I think.
Thank you, Greg. Again, just a quick follow-up on that security dilemma point that you mentioned. If you sort of zoom in on the Gulf states, the Iranian side always talks about how they want to have, a pan-regional security architecture in place. The last initiative was probably the Hormuz Peace Initiative. Mm-hmm. And invariably what they include is this notion the United States or any other extra-regional powers need to leave Iran with the smaller Gulf states. I mean, it seems to me like a non-starter. Why would you even put that on the table? It's not serious. What do you think? Do you then take the Iranian offers seriously? A, B, because I know you have spent so much time studying Arab counter responses. What do you think they're evolving in terms of their thinking? Now, when you have Kuwait ambassador returning last few weeks, the UAE ambassadors going, are they perhaps maybe ready to entertain the Iranian offers of regional peace, if you will, more seriously going forward because of the lack of alternative?
I think there's clearly signs that a number of the Gulf states would like to de-escalate the temperature with Iran. But that's in the context of a continuing American security commitment. You don't see the Kuwaitis throwing the American base out. And it does seem to me that the Iranian proposals that we've seen over the decades for a regional security architecture without great powers is just a non-starter for the Arab states of the Gulf, because Iran is the most powerful state in the Gulf, and they want some kind of balance against Iranian power. That was true in the days of the Shah too, when the Iranian regime was much less threatening domestically to the Gulf states. Pure balance of power here. Like Mahmoud, I think ideology is important in understanding these things, but I think the real driver here is balance of power politics.
Thank you, Greg. Randa, turning to you, and I hate to do this to you because we don't really know what's going on, but what do you make of what's going on right now in Iraq? What does that tell you about Iranian influence in that important Arab country? And what conclusions can one draw in terms of Iran's successes or failures in this very specific case? We can't hear you, Randa, if you could unmute.
Good to be with you. Let me start by saying that I think what happened in Iraq shows, in one hand, the success of Iran, but at the same time, the limits to its strategy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the solution yesterday, which happened, and we don't know yet the elements of the deal, which was engineered overnight by Najaf, by Sistani. It was not by Qani, or it was not by any Arab. It was an Iraqi, Najafi solution to the crisis. As I said, we don't know yet the elements of the deal, but it looks like that's what happened to bring the tensions down in Iraq and for Sadr and the coordination framework, the Iran allied groups, to withdraw from the green zone and agree to some kind of a roadmap. We don't know what the roadmap is, but it looks like there is a tentative agreement. So the limits of, Iraq is a perfect case of showing the limits of what Iran can do in the Arab region. On one hand, they have their allies in the PMF, and for this reason, they will always have a say over what Iraqi politics, over the trajectory of Iraqi politics in the future, like they have a say over the trajectory of Lebanese politics through Hezbollah. No decision can be made in Lebanon without, for example, the Hezbollah agreement. They have total veto power over decision-making. But at the same time, neither the coordination framework nor Hezbollah can impose solutions on the rest of the Iraqis on one hand, or on the rest of the Lebanese on the other hand. So there are limits inherent in the structure of the societies, Arab societies, be it Iraq and Lebanon, where, to what Iran can do through its allies and through its own power, whether it's soft or hard power. And so, and it's more so in Iraq, again, because of Najaf and the charisma, the authority, the gravitas it has vis-a-vis Qom or vis-a-vis Tehran, but also because of the nature of, because of the Iraqi political actors. In Lebanon, for example, as an example of Iranian intervention in the Arab world, one of its maxim has been is to push and eventually succeed in having a united Shia camp. In the beginning of its intervention in Lebanon, there were many dissenting voices inside Shia against Iranian role in Lebanon and Iranian presence in Lebanon. Those voices have been pretty much now made absent, although there is here and there some opposition inside the Shia community, but it's nothing to speak of. In Iraq, it's a little bit different. In Iraq, you have a country where you have a number of actors like Sadr, who can claim a heritage and who can claim a credibility that is rooted in historical leadership, religious leadership of his family, which Iran cannot stand against. In Lebanon, you have a collection of minorities, which again, Hezbollah, despite all its weapons, at best can exercise a veto power over decision-making, but cannot impose solutions, that are not enjoying consensus. So the nature of the society forces consensus politics, especially in places like Iraq and Lebanon, which in a way limit the power of Iranian proxies to basically, force their own preferred choices. The problem with Iran right now in the Arab region is the brand. The Iranian brand has suffered, especially among the Arab youth, and particularly among the Shia youth. The Iran brand in the Arab region, be it in Yemen, be it in Syria, be it in Lebanon, be it in Iraq, is a brand of failed governance, of civil wars, of associating with groups that have killed, civil society actors, and of funding groups and arming groups that have been responsible for killing these young actors. So with the youth generation, unless Iran can somehow basically change its brand it's going to be very hard long-term to keep exercising the kind of influence it does have now. It doesn't have an economic model that can appeal to Arab youth. There is a Dubai model that appeals to Arab youth. There is no Iranian economic model that appeals to Arab youth. The ideology is no longer there, and with the not demise, but with the diminution or the limitation of sectarian politics, which were prevalent in the last 10 years in the region, I think, again, the Iranian Shiite brand is likely to be less effective going forward than is the case.
Rana, that's a really powerful, point, a brand that's failing. But if you look at the last 10 years plus since the Arab Spring, and if you had to sort of give an overall grade, not just where we are today, but the last 10 years of Iranian performance from Yemen to Syria, elsewhere, how would you assess that? How would you grade them? And taking on board what you just said, that right now they're going to struggle going forward because they can't deliver on the jobs and all the rest of it. But what did they get right? And was it their own doing the last 10 years? Or was it because somebody else was messing up and Iran could come in and fill a vacuum?
No, it's the failure of the other side to have a commitment and a long-term strategy to counter Iranian influence in the region. I mean, Iran was willing, whether in Lebanon, starting in the 80s, after that in Syria during the civil war, with the Houthis, with the Iraqis after the invasion of Iraq, was willing to commit the resources to a long-term strategy of anchoring itself in the domestic politics of these countries. Saudi Arabia used to have that, but after the Iraq invasion, it basically stepped away, especially from a place like Iraq, and refused to contest that space. It's the contestation of the space that I think where Iran won by the other side not willing to engage in that contestation. Right.
Thank you. Randa, thank you for that. And let me turn to Mahmoud. And I want to ask you, Mahmoud, in terms of how you see things from Tehran's perspective, certainly the Islamic Republic officials' perspective, how open-ended of a commitment do you think they have signed up to in terms of their involvement in the Arab world? 22 countries, 400 million citizens, many of them struggling with all sorts of issues. Iran doesn't have the economic ability to be a new brand. So what is it going to do? I mean, even if the sanctions are lifted tomorrow in Iran, there is plenty of need to restructure the society and improve economic conditions inside. There won't be much left for places in the Arab world. So have the officials in Tehran essentially thought this through, do you think?
A few points. One, I want to emphasize the domestic structure argument that that part of the Iranian regional posturing has to do with the fact that through Iranian presence in the region and continued confrontation with the US and Israel, the leadership can also outmaneuver the non-revolutionary class inside Iran. So that has been continued over time. So the domestic element is very crucial. The other issue is that Iran is facing a dilemma. On the one hand, the governments over time, beginning with the Rafsanjani period, They want to reach out to Arab societies, Arab governments. They want to pursue commercial, economic, diplomatic relations. And then there's the deep state that is concerned with security and kind of keeping the US out of Iranian politics. Iraq is a classic example. I think Iran has been able to enlarge the playground within which it is confronting the US and Israel. Iraq, with the US, Iran is confronting Washington in Iraq, and also with Israel in Kurdistan of Iraq. So I think as long as national security, regime security concerns are there, this is going to continue. And Iran has invested heavily on its presence in the region. And even with the prospect of political succession in Iran, I think there are all kinds of indications that this will be a policy of continuity of Iranian power projection in the region. This will also linger on the prospects of the nuclear deal. To what degree this is going to be successful, whether or not the economic difficulties of Iran are going to continue, or Iran will have some relief, and then it will maybe change its attitude towards the region. But the last point I'd like to mention is the prospect of Iranian-Saudi relations. I think Iran does understand that its relations with Saudi Arabia is a fundamental issue in the totality of its relations with the Arab world. Now Iran is pushing to expedite the restoration of the diplomatic relations, and Saudi Arabia is interested in settling the Yemeni issue. Iran is interested in incremental approach. It wants to have access to the Yemeni leverage. On the other hand, Saudi Arabia wants kind of a large package deal with Iran with some degree of stability. Keep in mind, going back to 2003, 2004, Iran did have kind of a modus vivendi with Saudi Arabia, but it did not sustain. And because of the duality of the Iranian system, governments want to have diplomatic relations, and the deep state is interested in obviously security and regime security issues. So as long as we have this political system in place, and as long as it can sustain itself, I think this kind of duality in its approach towards the region will continue.
Thank you, Mahmoud. Just following up on that and going now to Greg. Greg, as you know better than me, far better than me, in fact, you know, a lot of the Arab world, particularly the smaller Gulf states and countries as far away as Morocco, their policy on Iran is greatly shaped on where Riyadh stands on Iran. And right now you've had 5 rounds of talks between the Iranians and the Saudis. We don't know where it's going, but in itself, those 5 rounds of talks have been positive. But, you know, Mahmoud was talking about Iran wants sort of to have diplomatic relations restored. What I hear from the Saudis is, yes, but there'll be a price to pay, and that price is clearly Yemen. Do you think that's going to be something realistically in the short term that Iran and the Saudis can talk about, a political settlement for the Yemeni crisis?
I do think it's something they can talk about, although settlement is might be too exaggerated a term for it, because there are plenty of reasons why Yemen is going to be a mess for some time, even if the Saudis and the Iranians can come to some agreement on what they'd like to see there. But yeah, I think Yemen is the bellwether for relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran. But I think even if the two sides were able to come to some agreement on what a temporary diplomatic solution to the Yemen crisis would look like, there's still these underlying issues in the relationship. I really don't think that we're going to see a Saudi-Iranian relationship that is friendly and cooperative in any way, shape, or form. Now, that doesn't mean that more tension or less tension is irrelevant. No, less tension is obviously good and something that Riyadh is seeking. But everyone in Riyadh remembers September 2019, which for them I think is really the kind of the most recent event in their relations with Iran that sticks in their mind, and that of course was the bombing of the Saudi oil facilities in Abqaiq and Khares, and the fact that could be done, and Riyadh attributed that to Iran, is something that nobody in Saudi Arabia and the decision-making level is going to forget anytime soon.
Thank you, Greg. Randa, if you want to quickly comment on the situation in Yemen, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, and how you think why Yemen plays such a central role for Iran. We know why, obviously, drives Saudi policy, but what is it the Iranians are after if it's not just leverage? And then I actually had a broader question for you, because you talked about the Arab states had failed in their counter strategy vis-a-vis Iran. And I wonder if you could sort of comment on what lessons they learned from the Donald Trump's maximum pressure campaign on Iran. What lessons did they learn from that campaign? Because my reading is they were left disappointed.
Totally. And I wanted to also comment on what Greg said in terms of what the Arab states remember from 2019. They also remember that the American administration was not there for them. And so there's still today a lingering resentment in the region over what the American state did not do in 2019 when the oil installation in Abqaiq were attacked by Iranian drones. And in my opinion, that's what's driving partly this de-escalation trend that we see in the region. In addition to the Ukraine war, we have not talked about the Ukraine war yet, but the Ukraine war is, for the first time in a way, in the history of the region, for the last 20 years, you have a major war taking place outside the Middle East geographical boundaries. That has forced some kind of, in a way, not reckoning, but a reassessment in the region. And I have to say mostly in the Arab region, but also I think in Iran. And Mahmoud can speak more about Iran than I do, than I can, speak about Iran. But of the need to, de-escalate tensions, think about a new security architecture. That's partly what drives also their hedging policies vis-a-vis, the Ukraine war in terms of not siding with either Russia or the United States. And that's a new factor, in my opinion, in the region that need to be taken into consideration of the calculi of the leaders. So I see this de-escalation trend, which both of my colleagues have spoken about, is still in its beginning phase, but I see it's much stronger than I thought maybe a few months ago. Mm-hmm. It's not going to lead to a total fundamental transformational change in Iran-Saudi relationship, but there is a commitment, at least on the Saudi side and definitely on the Iran side, to continue to pursue this path forward. At the same time, there is a commitment or an interest and on the Saudi side to also continue at some point, or to pursue at some point, normalization with Israel. So there is a shift in geopolitics today taking place, at least, especially among GCC, of not looking at US as a given, or at the alliance with the US as a given. Again, given whether we can agree or not on US is retrenching from the region or not, but the perception is there that for the last 10 years, the US has been talking about deprioritization of the region, and now it's starting to sink in my opinion, more than before. It doesn't mean that they are going to abandon the security umbrella. As Greg said, they are going to pursue, and they want to pursue dialogue with Iran under the security umbrella of the United States. But this commitment to dialogue with Iran over Yemen, over political relations between Saudi and Iran, the same thing on the UAE side, the same thing on Kuwait now with the sending back of ambassadors from Kuwait and UAE, is going to continue irrespective of what happens with the JCPOA, irrespective of whether US resorts back to maximum pressure or not. because it's driven by regional interest, it's driven by regional assessment of what are the interests of these different countries. And I have to say that if there is one commonality between Iran and Arab regime, it's both are totally committed to the survival of their respective regime as a priority. And that's a uniting factor in the region. So going forward, I see this de-escalation trend will continue. Whether it will lead to a settlement of the Yemen war, I agree with Greg. The Yemen war now has too many drivers. Many of them are local rather than regional, and it's going to take a long time to unwind the mess there. But at least on the main conflict axis in the region, GCC Iran, GCC Turkey, even Turkey Egypt, I see the trends toward de-escalation, rapprochement to continue. The question is, and I hear it from the Iranian sides in the track to dialogue that I do, and maybe Mahmoud can answer this. The question is, what can Arab offer Iran to change its regional posture? We always talk about Iran's regional behavior. Okay, so in negotiation, what will Arab put on the table as incentives to change Iran's regional behavior?
Thank you, Randa. I will make sure to pose that question to Mahmoud next, but also before I do that, Mahmoud, just a quick question here for you from the audience. What is the balance between the national interest of Iran versus the Islamic Republic, this political entity that has its own interests? Because you spoke a lot about how security calculations have been driving Iran forward. But, you know, isn't there a counter to that? And if that is the case, I mean, who speaks for that in Iran? I mean, we know people like Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, Rafsanjani, and so on criticized Iran's policies in places like Syria, but they were quickly sidelined. So isn't there a counter within the Iranian regime, or sort of polity, if you will, to say, you know what, maybe we should change course slightly. We don't have to change course entirely, but slightly for the sake of the national interest. But what do you think of that national interest versus the ideological balance in Iranian calculations?
It will all depend how we define national interest, of course. Another conceptual issue that Greg, I'm sure, is interested in to talk about. But if you ask me, what is Iran's national interest? I would say it's the economic development of the country, and turning Iran into another Malaysia, Indonesia, and potentially in the distant future into South Korea. But since day one, in the aftermath of the revolution, economic development has never been a priority of Iranian leadership. And I would say maybe number 3, number 4. In the categories. It's always been national security. And even to be more precise, it has always been regime security. And I think going back to Randa's question, I think the main concern in Iran's regional approach is basically the United States and Israel now. So there's not much the Arab countries can do in order to change Iran's behavior. It hinges on domestic politics. And then there is quite a bit of paranoia about American designs on Iran. And so the vulnerability and the fears of security, they motivate the regional approach. Otherwise, Iran has all the prerequisites to emerge as an economic giant in the region. The other thing that kind of makes issues far more complex in Iranian-Arab relations, and is that even before the Iranian Revolution, Arab societies in general and Arab governments, they will never accept an Iranian regional hegemony. And it will never be accepted. Where was Iran in the Arab Spring? It was absent. Where was the Iranian ideology in Cairo, in Damascus, in Tunisia, and other Arab countries? So the attraction is not ideology. The only country that really stands out in my personal experience and also my conversations with both politicians and academics is Egypt. Egypt is the only country that stands out in its approach, in its definition of Iran. It looks at Iran as an ancient country, as a civilization, as a country of literature, culture, and great potential in terms of being a partner. But again, for many different reasons, Egypt has not been able to reach out to Iran, and that's also security in Egypt. So I think for the time being, security stands out in Iranian priorities, and by that I mean concerns about the United States and Israel. I mean, there is an actual war going on between Iran and Israel in the region today. At least it is a psychological war, but there's also some element of symmetric and asymmetric warfare between the two countries. So for those who are making the decisions, and they're not the Iranian economists, and these are men of military background and those who fought in the Iran-Iraq war, their perceptions of the region and national security is that they need to keep US and Israel out. And in order to do that, you need to make heavy investments in Iraq and make sure you're in Syria for the long horizon, because you need southern Lebanon as a very strategic leverage vis-a-vis Israel. And then, of course, Yemen emerges as another leverage. So I think going back to the first phase of our conversation, it really hinges on domestic politics in Iran.
Right. Thank you, Mahmoud. Greg, turning to you, and I'm going to oversimplify massively what Mahmoud just said, but it sounds maybe one way of looking at it is, if the United States could guarantee the Islamic Republic that regime change is seriously not going to be pursued, then the Iranians have far less desire to be involved in the Arab world. What do you make of that argument? And let me also, my own question for you. Recently I was with an MEI team. We visited Saudi Arabia, and the notion of nation building is a serious endeavor right now in Saudi Arabia. So focusing on the youth and to the extent that they're pursuing the idea of reform internally is real. That means less time and space, perhaps, for foreign policy agendas in the region. What do you make of that? Would that make a big difference if Iran doesn't have to fight off the Saudis in Lebanon or in Syria or in Iraq? What do you see that having an impact going forward?
A couple of points, Alex. First off, I think that if there's many American administrations that have publicly, and I'm sure privately, tried to reassure the Iranians that they weren't seeking regime change, and the Iranians just considered that to be cheap talk. And then every once in a while you get an administration that pretty clearly was seeking regime change, whether it was people who call Iran part of an axis of evil or wanted to apply maximum pressure to it. And so I can understand why Iranians might take those kinds of promises, the top level of the regime anyway, take those kind of promises as cheap talk. But I don't think that that's a reason not to do it. I think the Biden administration should reassure the Iranians. We don't want regime change in Iran. And even if we did, there was nothing, it's been demonstrated there's nothing America can do to achieve that. So I think that even though I don't think it would change Iranian behavior, I think the United States should reassure on that level. The other point about Saudi nation building, yes, there's changes happening in Saudi Arabia. There's no question about it. But I think it's wrong for us to think that there's some kind of dichotomy between you concentrate on foreign policy or concentrate on domestic politics. It seems to me that Mohammed bin Salman is pursuing a foreign policy that's trying to increase the Saudi role in the region. He did it at the beginning in a rather ham-fisted way, militarily and with threats and kidnapping the prime minister of Lebanon, and you know, in a very kind of bull in the china shop way. But that doesn't mean that he's completely withdrawn from the foreign policy realm. I think initiatives toward Russia in the Ukraine war are extremely interesting, and the overall Saudi-Russian relationship, obviously the relationship with China, the effort to de-escalate in Yemen without completely withdrawing, as to some extent the UAE did, although the UAE obviously still has political influence in there. So I wouldn't say that MBS's efforts to change Saudi Arabia domestically mean that he's not going to be involved in foreign policy. I do think Rhonda is absolutely right that one of the things that really brought the Saudis, and particularly MBS, up short was 2019, when you had an American administration that said it was very tough on Iran, maximum pressure. Right. And yet when Iran took actions against what American administrations for 6 decades had said the reason they're in the Persian Gulf is, which is to protect the free flow of oil, and the American administration did nothing in response, I think it did make people in Saudi Arabia think more than once and seek a reduction in tensions, as Rhonda said. And that reduction in tensions doesn't solve all the problems, but perhaps could lead to some diplomatic progress on Yemen and maybe in other areas, who knows. But it's more of a détente than a complete solution to the underlying tensions in the Saudi-Iranian relationship.
Thank you very much, Greg. Rhonda, I had a question for you on the brand issue, if you don't mind. And by the way, react to anything you've heard so far. I mean, floor is yours. It's your turn. But you know, one of the questions here specifically touches on the role of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the Iranian supreme leader. For 33 years, he's been basically running the show in Iran. We know how deeply he and the generals in the Revolutionary Guards are committed to being involved in the Arab world. Well, how do you think he's perceived today? Because you're talking about how the Iranian brand is struggling. Does that mean Khamenei is struggling? And this is going to actually open up my question for the next round, which I'm going to ask all three of you on the issue of the axis of resistance versus the Abraham Accords. But you go ahead, Rhonda, and tell us what you think about Khamenei's position right now in the Arab world.
Can I comment quickly first on something Greg just said about this? You know, it's not either or, you know, domestic versus foreign policy. But in one hand, also the focus, especially in Saudi Arabia, on the economic priorities partly underpins now their foreign policy. And as a Saudi interlocutor recently at Iraq 2 Dialogue said to me, I mean, in fact, it was, yeah, he said, we cannot have Vision 2030 while the Yemen war is going. We cannot have Vision 2030 succeed while the Yemen war is still going on the way it has been. The same thing you hear about other priorities, you know, in the rest of the region, especially in the UAE. And so I think as these countries, especially with the host of challenges facing them, from food insecurity, not only with their countries, of course, but for the rest of the region, because eventually the Gulf countries are going to be called upon to deliver the kind of assistance and help that struggling economies, especially ones like Egypt, need. And they have been doing so, and they will continue to do so. So you have a host of challenges, from the food and energy insecurity to the climate. I mean, look at the recent dust storms in Iraq and the Gulf. So you have, you know, most of the region now facing climate emergencies, drought, you know, dust storm, as I said, fires. So I think that is going to come as priorities, and as I said, drive their approach to foreign policy, hence the de-escalation trend. They need to work with Iran on climate. They need to work, they need to make sure these tensions, you know, with Iran get how to say, pushed to the back burner in order for them to focus on the domestic emergencies, but also the regional emergencies. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean it solves, it doesn't mean trust is going to be built. The level of mistrust between Iran on one hand and the Arab countries on the other is humongous, humongous. It doesn't mean they're going to have suddenly, be able to solve all these other regional wars from Libya to Syria to Iraq to Lebanon. At best, they stay frozen for a while. And so whatever we are seeing today in terms of de-escalation, I see it still as a tactical, bordering on strategic pose. I wouldn't qualify it totally as strategic. It's tactical, bordering on strategic pose, again, driven by geopolitics, driven by domestic priorities. Now, going back to your question about Khamenei. Look, I mean, and I'm talking here from the Arab perspectives, and especially, countries I'm most familiar with, where Iran has a lot of presence: Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Yemen, partly. I think, he's an old guy. Their approach to the old leadership is the same approach to the old leadership in their respective countries. Again, I don't see whether they associate the brand with Khamenei himself. They associate it with the Iranian regime. So going forward, even if you have a different supreme leader, succeeding Khamenei, unless, as Mahmoud said, you are a total overhaul of domestic politics in the country under that new leadership, I think that brand will continue to be the same it is today in the eyes of most of the Arab youth generation. I'm not talking about the hardcore Hezbollahis in Lebanon. I'm not talking about the hardcore Asa'ib Ahl al-Haq in Iraq. Those are khalas. Those are lost to the cause, or they are, too much, enmeshed and invested in the cause. They will, and it has become part of their own identity, not only as a Shia, but also as an Iraqi or as a Lebanese. No, I'm talking about a big chunk of the Arab youth in Iraq and the Shia youth in Iraq. And I'm talking about a big chunk of the youth in Lebanon, including Shia youth. And I'm talking also about a big chunk of Syria youth, at the same time also of Yemen youth. That brand is not, again, about the leadership, the supreme leader. It's more about the Iranian regime. It's about the Iranian state.
Thank you. We have about 5 minutes left. You have given us so much to think about and digest here. I thank all those questions that came in. This last 5 minutes we have, if you don't mind, and I wanted to ask this question: Axis of resistance versus Abraham Accords. Axis of resistance been around since the early 80s. It has its supporters to this day, but I think a lot of us see it as struggling. Certainly in its mission against Israel, it hasn't achieved, although we hear from Tehran that it will eventually prevail. But I wanted to ask you first, Mahmoud, what do you think of the chances of Abraham Accord basically outshining the Axis of resistance across the region if it delivers? It's early days, it's been around for 2 years, but if it does create jobs, if it does create regional solutions to regional problems of climate change, how do you think that's going to put pressure on Khomeinism or Khamenism in the region?
To me, the most critical analytical unit about Iran in terms of understanding Iranian behavior is the elite structure in Iran. And I think that question lingers on the whole issue of resources, how the leadership is going to approach resources in the future. Iran is facing a range of soft problems, from environment, inflation, education, healthcare, and immigration, and other social and national issues. So how will Iran be able to manage both domestic issues and then maintain its foreign policy posturing? There's been a consistent issue in Iranian academic circles for the last 30 years, that how could a developing country pursue a foreign policy that has no linkages to its national economic development? And they've been so contradictory over time. So the question is, how long can Iran sustain this separation of priorities in terms of economic development and foreign policy? I think we're facing a bipolar Middle East. We need to talk about Russia to some degree, how Russia's re-entry to the region and Iranian somewhat pivot to Moscow will change the regional geopolitics. But I will say one thing: Iran is a country of surprises, and its history is full of U-turns. And so I think we need to look at the dynamics in Iranian political succession. And will that change Iranian priorities? Will Iranian leadership be under pressure to devote more resources to domestic and national issues rather than regional posturing?
Thank you, Mahmoud. Greg, please, on the same question, and maybe you want to sort of add a few things, if you will, from a U.S. perspective. How can the U.S. maybe, if there is a nuclear deal, help the Iranians choose national interest over ideological petty projects?
Yeah, I don't think the Americans can do much on that score. Reassured, but to the extent that they can, I don't think they'll be believed. I don't have any argument with Mahmoud on any of these things. As you can see, we even wore the same necktie to today's Zoom. So, but I just want to say a couple of things about the Abraham Accords. I'm a real cynic about them. I don't think they change anything in the region. I do think that there's economic complementarity between Israel and the UAE. I'm not sure how much that affects the rest of the region. I think that on the geopolitical or Paul Mill side, there had already been plenty of cooperation between the UAE and some other Arab states and Israel on the security side. I don't see the Abraham Accords basically changing much of anything, but I am in the minority among most of my colleagues. I see the Abraham Accords as being a reaffirmation of how important the United States is in the region. Many people see it as a reaction to American retrenchment. To me, it's every Arab accord with Israel from Camp David has basically been an agreement with the United States. And it seems to me that the UAE was trying to make the Trump administration happy, because Mr. Kushner was doing nothing but trying to get the Abraham Accords at the end. And I think the UAE folks are smart enough to know that their best protection against a hostile turn in American policy toward it is having good relations with Israel. And so whether it was a Republican or a Democratic administration, the Abraham Accords were going to help the UAE with the United States. And I think that in every other case, the Abraham Accords were a quid pro quo with the United States. And so to me, the Abraham Accords don't change much of anything in the region. And I think we have a tendency to exaggerate.
Thank you, Greg. Rana, you get the last word here. We got about a minute or so. Forgive me for giving you a minute or so, but whatever you want to say on Abraham Accords versus axis of resistance, or anything else you'd like to sort of finish us off with.
So on the Abraham Accords, yes, they did not change much in the region, but on the other hand, they have become a part of the regional fabric, and they are here to stay. Whether they are going to eventually expand to include Saudi Arabia, which will have its own eventually agreement with Israel, is debatable, but they are part of the regional fabric and affect some of the calculi of the regional actors. On the axis of resistance, I think it's here to stay as long as these broken states, that Gregory referred to, are there. There is a milieu in which Iran can where Iran can entrench itself by appealing to local grievances, by mining local grievances, and by allying itself with a message of marginalization and supporting the marginalized and supporting the weak or whatever. And again, through its affinity, the religious affinity that many Shia in the Arab region feel vis-a-vis Iran as a country where Shiism is one of the driving principles of if not the driving principle of the country's politics. And so both of them are here to stay, in my opinion. Are they there to really counterbalance each other, or I don't see that. I see they are there because they are driven by different considerations in each country's, which is party of either the axis of resistance or the Abraham Accords.
Thank you, Randa. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Mahmoud. You are three world-renowned experts. We're delighted that you had the time to join us for this 1-hour panel discussion on Iran's Arab strategy. And thank you to everyone who joined us for your questions. We hope you enjoyed it. We hope you come back and see more of these panels that we have on here at the Middle East Institute. But, you know, a fast-moving topic. Iran's Arab strategy is multifaceted. Lots of things to watch out for. But at least we got a glimpse into some of the latest drivers from Washington, from a U.S. perspective, from an Iranian perspective, from an Arab perspective. And I thank again our panelists for joining us. Thank you all very much. I think that's it from me. I just wish you all a very good day. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.